The vast auditorium of Georgetown University Law Center fell into absolute silence, the hum of whispers fading until only the sound of soft breathing filled the air. The atmosphere carried the weight of history. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg sat upright on stage, her frail figure cloaked in quiet strength that seemed to command every inch of the room. Though age and illness had etched their marks upon her, her gaze, sharp and discerning, remained fierce, unyielding. Those watchful eyes were now fixed upon the podium, where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood, poised and resolute beneath the bright lights. "Justice Ginsburg," Crockett began, her voice steady yet charged with conviction, echoing across the marble hall. "With the deepest respect for your legacy, I have to say this. Your slow, cautious path toward women's equality has not gone far enough. While you sought compromise, women continued to suffer. Your friendship with Justice Scalia is part of that failure, choosing civility when justice demanded confrontation." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. The audience gasped. Rows of law students exchanged wide-eyed glances. Professors shifted uncomfortably. Had a sitting congresswoman truly just challenged the notorious RBG to her face? The 87-year-old justice didn't react immediately. Slowly, she lifted her glasses, folded them neatly, and placed them beside her notes. The only sign of emotion, a faint tightening at the corner of her mouth. For those who knew her, that subtle movement spoke volumes. It was rare for Ruth Bader Ginsburg to show anger. What would follow, no one in that hall could have predicted. What unfolded next would reshape the nation's perception of one of its most revered legal minds. Before we dive deeper into this unforgettable exchange, one that has gripped scholars, pundits, and everyday citizens alike, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications, because what happened between these two women revealed raw truths about power, principle, and the evolving fight for equality. The Georgetown Symposium on Women and the Constitution had been organized to celebrate Ginsburg's lifetime of achievement. Over 6 decades, she had carved her name into history, from the young law student defying discrimination at Harvard and Columbia, to the ACLU lawyer rewriting the legal meaning of equality, to her 27 transformative years on the Supreme Court. By 87, she was no longer just a jurist, she was an icon. Her image appeared on coffee mugs and protest signs. Her workout routines became legend. The lace collar she wore in dissent had become a universal symbol of resistance through reason. To millions, RBG stood for measured strategic feminism, change built case by case, brick by brick, through law, not outrage, but to a new generation. That patience looked like surrender. Among young progressives, frustration had grown. Some accused her of clinging to her seat during the Obama years, risking everything she'd built to political chance. Others said her friendship with Justice Antonin Scalia, the ideological opposite she called her best buddy, symbolized a dangerous tolerance toward those who dismantled hard-won rights. Still, Ginsburg remained true to her judicial nature, deliberate, logical, preferring persuasion over fury. Standing across from her was Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the embodiment of everything Ginsburg's generation wasn't. At 42, the bold Texas Democrat had risen from the trenches of courtroom defense to the halls of Congress. A former civil rights attorney who had defended protesters and activists, she thrived on direct confrontation. Her fiery floor speeches had gone viral, capturing millions who admired her refusal to compromise on justice. That night's event was meant to be a dialogue between generations, a bridge between cautious reform and relentless activism. The organizers, led by Professor Elena Kagan, then still a scholar, had pleaded with both women to keep the discussion academic, not personal. But the moment Crockett took the podium, it became clear that she had no intention of keeping the peace. The discussion that followed was far more than disagreement. It was the clash of two eras. It asked the question haunting every movement for justice. Is progress built patiently from within systems, or wrestled from them by force? It also reignited the rift within modern feminism itself. Were younger activists ungrateful rebels, or were they simply refusing to wait any longer? For Ginsburg, this confrontation tested the very philosophy that had guided her life. For Crockett, It was her moment to challenge what she saw as an outdated creed that disguised restraint as wisdom. Everyone in the hall, students, journalists, lawmakers, knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Inside the paneled walls of Georgetown's grand chamber, surrounded by portraits of judicial giants, Crockett lifted her chin. "Let me be clear about my concern," she said firmly. Turning toward the justice, her voice grew sharper, fueled by the crowd's restless energy. "Your pattern of compromise with conservatives hasn't protected us. It's empowered them. Every time you chose civility, they pushed the line further. Here," she said, holding up a sheet of paper for the audience to see, "is Justice Scalia's record, his votes against women's rights, LGBTQ protections, and voting access. These aren't abstract positions. These are real lives. Yet you called him your best friend and went to the opera with him," the crowd murmured uneasily. The moderator, a Georgetown professor, leaned forward nervously. "Congresswoman," she interjected softly, "perhaps we could keep the discussion focused on constitutional interpretation." "This is constitutional," Crockett snapped. "Pretending those who deny equality are just colleagues with different views is exactly how injustice survives." The hall crackled with tension. "Your cautious, step-by-step approach may have worked in the 1970s, Crockett continued. "But rights today are vanishing faster than we can defend them. And while we're on it, let's talk about your refusal to retire during the Obama years. That single decision endangered everything you fought for. You gambled with the rights of millions because you couldn't let go of your seat." Gasps rippled through the audience. A judge in the front row shook her head, whispering in disapproval. But Crockett pressed forward, relentless. "And let's not forget Shelby County versus Holder. You gutted the Voting Rights Act." A low wave of murmurs swept the crowd. "Wrong justice," someone called out from the audience. Crockett hesitated for only a beat before recovering. "My point still stands," she said firmly. "This court has dismantled civil rights piece by piece, and your polite approach hasn't stopped it." Her tone softened. "Though the conviction didn't fade, you once said, 'Women belong in all places where decisions are made.' I agree. But we must also recognize when those decisions cause harm and respond with urgency. The luxury of slow progress belongs to those who aren't already losing everything. Women of color, working mothers, the poor, they can't afford patience." The air grew heavy. Some students who once idolized Ginsburg found themselves torn, respecting her brilliance, yet drawn to Crockett's fire. Older attorneys and scholars shook their heads, whispering about decorum and respect. Through it all, Justice Ginsburg remained perfectly still. Her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression unreadable. It was the same calm she had carried through decades of dissent and endurance. "We should move to audience questions," the moderator urged. "Just one final point," Crockett said, refusing to yield. "Justice Ginsburg's famous dissents are beautiful, yes, but they're still dissents. Elegant words without the power to protect the vulnerable. They've become slogans, not shields. We don't need poetic resistance. We need courage that bites, not civility that comforts." When she finally stopped, the silence was deafening. The moderator turned toward Ginsburg. "Justice, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's comments?" Every eye locked on the frail but formidable figure at center stage. Some expected her to stay silent. Others braced for a polite diplomatic deflection. Instead, Ginsburg slowly leaned forward, the light glinting off her silver dissent collar. "I would be glad to respond," she said quietly, her Brooklyn accent unsoftened by age. After all, open debate is the lifeblood of democracy. Her tone was steady, judicial, deliberate. "It appears the Congresswoman and I differ deeply on how lasting change is achieved within a constitutional democracy," she continued. "But this disagreement is not new. It has echoed through every fight for equality in our nation's history." The crowd leaned in, mesmerized as the legendary justice prepared to defend not just her record, but her entire philosophy. Taking a slow sip of water, she looked up once more, her voice calm yet unflinching, the same voice that once silenced an all-male Supreme Court. "Congresswoman Crockett believes my approach has been too patient," she said. "She views my friendship with Justice Scalia not as respect across disagreement, but as betrayal. Yet perhaps... Ginsburg paused, reaching beside her chair for a thin folder no one had noticed before. Perhaps I can offer some context. From the folder, she withdrew a few documents and straightened them carefully. I'd like to begin, she said, her tone quiet but commanding, with a brief history lesson. When I began fighting gender discrimination in the 1970s, women could be fired for being pregnant. Banks could deny credit cards to single women. State universities could turn women away simply because of their gender. And marital rape wasn't even recognized as a crime. She slowly opened a folder before her. I chose to challenge this system one case at a time. Not because I lacked bravery, but because I understood how our legal foundation works. Each precedent builds on the one before it. Her eyes met Congresswoman Crockett. You call that a timid approach? Let me remind you of Sally Reed, who was denied the right to manage her late son's estate because she was a woman. Or Sharon Frontiero, who fought to receive equal military benefits as her male peers. Or Stephen Weisenfeld, who was refused survivor benefits after his wife died, giving birth, leaving him to raise their child alone. These weren't theories. They were real lives, real pain, and real justice. On the line, turning another page. Ginsburg continued when I stood before an all-male Supreme Court on Sharon. Frontiero's behalf, I could have accused them of upholding a patriarchal system. But instead, I appealed to their humanity. It showed them how gender bias hurts not only women, but also men and their daughters, too. Her voice softened just slightly. That wasn't weakness, Congresswoman. That was strategy. I was building a path forward when the odds were stacked against every woman in America. A few people in the audience nodded, their expressions shifting as they absorbed the depth of her words. You've also said my friendship with Justice Scalia was a moral failure, Ginsburg said evenly, lifting another document. Let me explain what that friendship achieved. This is a draft of Scalia's opinion in United States v. Virginia, the case that opened the Virginia Military Institute to women. His first version would have limited the impact of the ruling, but after many discussions between two people who respected each other despite deep differences, he removed that limiting language. He didn't change his vote, but our friendship helped change the words that shaped history. Would you call that surrender, Congresswoman? I call it influence, quiet, deliberate, effective advocacy. Crockett shifted at the podium, her earlier confidence fading as the audience leaned in closer. As for my dissents, Ginsburg continued, you call them symbolic, but you misunderstand their power. A dissent has three purposes. It challenges the majority, it guides future lawyers, and it speaks to generations yet to come. She removed her glasses, meeting Crockett's eyes directly. When I wrote that striking down the Voting Rights Act was like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you aren't getting wet. I wasn't trying to be clever. I was leaving a message for future courts, a principle that civil rights lawyers still use today. Law professors in the audience nodded, whispering in agreement. You mentioned my decision not to retire during President Obama's term. She continued calm but firm. I made that choice based on my health and my ability to serve. No one can predict the future. We make decisions with the knowledge we have at the time. She aligned her paper's every movement measured. But there's something larger in your criticism, Congresswoman. You speak as if there are only two ways to fight for justice, submission or confrontation. That's a false choice. Ginsburg leaned forwards lightly, her voice gaining quiet force. Real progress requires many strategies working together. While I was building legal precedent, others were marching in the streets. While I persuaded conservative judges with reason, others were demanding radical change. Both were necessary. Neither was enough alone. The room grew still. Even the most skeptic listeners were now hanging on her every word. You think my gradual approach came from caution? She said, pausing. It didn't. It came from understanding how this system works. From knowing that lasting change must be built step by step, case by case. She closed her folder gently. The precedents we established, those that finally recognized gender discrimination, unconstitutional, became the very tools today's advocates now use to go further. Ginsburg took a slow breath, her eyes steady. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. once said, she began, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. It bends because people pull from every direction. Some push loudly, others pull quietly, but all of us in our own way move it forward. The arc of the moral universe is long, Justice Ginsburg began softly, but it bends toward justice. She paused before continuing, her voice gaining quiet strength. What people often forget is that it doesn't bend by itself. It bends because people, determined, persistent people, pull it that way. Some work from within institutions, slowly reshaping them from the inside. Others push from outside, demanding faster, more visible change. Her tone shifted, calm yet instructive, like a seasoned professor addressing a bright but impatient student. You speak as if my approach failed because West'll fight many of the same battles, but that's not how progress works. Change isn't a straight line. It comes in waves and victories and setbacks in forward motion, followed by resistance. Ginsburg gestured toward the portraits of legal pioneers hanging across the auditorium. Did Thud Marshall's work fail because racism still exists? Did Susan B. Anoni's efforts fail because women still face inequality? Of course not. Their victories built the foundation for every fight that came after. The struggle continues not because they failed, but because real progress demands endurance across generations. Her expression softened as she continued. You dismissed the merchandise with my face as performative, she said gently. But those shirts and posters have helped a generation of young women see themselves as future lawyers, judges, even justices. Don't underestimate the power of symbols. Representation matters. Inspiration matters. Sometimes seeing a reflection of yourself in power is the spark that starts a lifelong pursuit of justice. She sat straighter, already poised, yet somehow finding a way to look even more composed. As for your critique of my opinions and dissents, she said, I'd suggest taking another look in United States versus Virginia. I wrote for the majority that gender-based laws must meet an exceedingly persuasive justification that STND, one of the strongest ever applied to gender discrimination, continues to protect women's rights to this very day. Ginsburg folded her hands neatly on the table, her voice now softer but firm. I've dedicated my entire life to fighting for equality with persistence, precision, and a deep understanding of how institutions evolve. You may choose a different path, and that's your right. The movement needs all kinds of warriors. But never mistake patience for weakness or civility for surrender. The room was utterly silent now. Her words carried not through volume, but through clarity, the kind that demands complete attention. Some of us pick our battles carefully, she continued, not because we lack courage, but because we know that lasting change requires balance, bold vision, and careful strategy, passion and persuasion, moral fire, and legal craftsmanship. True progress needs both righteous anger and reasoned advocacy. Her gaze swept across the silent audience. I respect your passion, Congresswoman, she said finally. I share your frustration with how slow change can feel. But wisdom lies in knowing when to confront and when to persuade, when to demand and when to listen, when to speak from fury and when to speak in a language your opponent can actually hear. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. Congresswoman Crockett stood frozen behind the podium, her expression a mix of awe and humility. Ginsburg hadn't shouted, hadn't scolded, yet her calm, factual dismantling of Crockett's argument left the entire room breathless. What they had just witnessed was not a clash, but a revelation, a masterclass in strategy from one of history's greatest legal minds. The moderator finally broke the silence. Thank you, Justice Ginsburg. Congresswoman, would you like to respond? Crockett glanced down at her notes, then up at the legendary figure before her. I appreciate Justice Ginsburg's perspective, she said quietly. There's a lot here for all of us to think about. As she returned to her seat, the tension in the auditorium gave way to quiet respect, a collective awareness that they had witnessed something extraordinary within hours. Clips from the Georgetown Law Symposium spread across social media. Hashtags like strategic advocacy and RBG masterclass trended nationwide. News outlets rushed to analyze the exchange. SCOTUS's blog called it a rare window into Justice Ginsburg's judicial philosophy and her theory of lasting change. The New York Times described it as a generational debate that exposed two distinct visions of progress in a democracy on cable networks. Legal experts dissected every line. CNN's Jeffrey Toobin observed, this wasn't just Ginsburg defending herself. It was Ginsburg defending a philosophy that lasting progress comes from persuasion and preceded, not just protest. On MSNBC, a panel of women's rights attorneys spanning 3 generations echoed that sentiment. Justice Ginsburg reminded use one former Sealier said that there's a difference between compromise and strategy. Justice Ginsburg never compromised on her ultimate goal, full equality. What set her apart was how strategically she moved toward it, always thinking several steps ahead. In the days following the viral Georgetown exchange, law schools across the country began dissecting what had happened. Professors incorporated the debate into their lessons almost immediately. At Harvard Law, students crowded into a lecture hall for a spontaneous discussion about advocacy styles. Over at Howard University School of Law, a civil rights professor used the viral clip as a modern-day case study in how movements create institutional change. For Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the aftermath was far more complex. Her social media feeds exploded, a mix of sharp criticism and thoughtful commentary. In her first public statement, she reaffirmed her deep respect for Justice Ginsburg's legacy, but also insisted that modern times demand new approaches to activism. Days later, Crockett penned a longer reflection in The Atlantic. My exchange with Justice Ginsburg has made me think deeply about the relationship between different forms of advocacy. She wrote, "While I still believe bold voices are essential for progress, I've gained a new respect for the legal groundwork that makes those voices effective." The most profound reactions came from young lawyers and activists who had been torn between Ginsburg's patient, strategic style and Crockett's urgent call for direct action. They debated passionately online and in classrooms. How does real change happen? Through careful institution building or through bold public confrontation? A young public defender summed it up perfectly in Averill blog post. Maybe the truth is we need both. We need the RBGs of the world building, the legal framework brick by brick, and the activists in the streets demanding faster progress. These aren't opposing forces, they're complementary ones. A week after the symposium, Justice Ginsburg appeared on NPR with journalist Nia Totenberg. When asked about the confrontation, her response was characteristically thoughtful. The Congresswoman raised important questions that deserve reflection. She said, "Every generation must find its own way in the fight for equality. My generation laid down certain legal foundations. How the next generation builds upon them is up to them." When Totenberg asked if the criticism had upset her, Ginsburg smiled slightly. "In my career, I was told I didn't belong in law school because I was taking a man's place. I was denied clerkships despite graduating at the top of my class. I was paid less for the same work. Compared to that, respectful criticism of my judicial philosophy is hardly something to lose sleep over." The exchange didn't just inspire headlines. It changed legal education itself. Law schools saw a surge of interest in courses about strategic advocacy and the history of civil rights litigation. Georgetown Law even launched an annual lecture series titled Multiple Paths to Justice, celebrating the idea that progress takes many forms. 6 months later, Justice Ginsburg announced her retirement due to health reasons. In her statement, she referenced the Georgetown debate directly. The conversation about how to advance equality must continue across generations. Each era builds on those who came before, sometimes by following their steps, sometimes by forging new ones. At her final public appearance before stepping down, she was asked what advice she had for young advocates growing impatient for change. Her answer spoke volumes. "Fight for the things you care about," she said, "but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. Real change takes time. Be strategic. Be persistent. And remember, sometimes the most radical act isn't tearing down institutions, but transforming them from within." 3 years later, that message came full circle. Congresswoman Crockett introduced a bill to strengthen voting rights protections. During the floor debate, she cited Justice Ginsburg's powerful dissent in Shelby County versus Holder, quoting her warning about throwing away umbrellas in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. When the bill passed with bipartisan support, Crockett acknowledged that it stood on the foundation Justice Ginsburg and earlier civil rights pioneers had built proof that vision and strategy could indeed work together. In the end, the Georgetown Symposium became far more than a viral video. It became a landmark lesson, a blueprint for how movements evolve, how generational differences can drive progress, and how disagreement, when handled with respect, can strengthen the cause of justice. As one constitutional scholar later wrote, the Ginsburg-Crockett exchange wasn't about who was right. It was about understanding that progress requires both the architects who build slowly and the visionaries who push urgently. Their tension isn't weakness. It's the engine that keeps justice moving forward. Thank you for watching this in-depth look at the historic debate between Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. If this story helped you see the fight for equality in a new light, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this video with others who care about justice. And now we'd love to hear from you. Do you believe change comes faster through patient strategy or bold confrontation? Or do we truly need both? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the conversation. Together we shape the next chapter in the fight for equality and progress.